June 6, 1944. Normandy, France, 16 minutes past midnight. British paratroopers descended through darkness toward German-occupied France. Among them, Sergeant Sidney Cornell of Portsmouth, 6th Airborne Division, B Company, 7th Parachute Battalion. One of the first black British paratroopers to jump into combat. His mission: secure bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River. But within the first hour, radios failed across the drop zone. Wireless set number 18 and number 38 equipment went silent. Units landed dispersed, containers lost in hedgerows, orders trapped at headquarters. German counterattacks would come at dawn. Coordination depended on one solution: runners. Cornell would sprint across open ground under machine gun and mortar fire, carrying messages that kept defensive positions synchronized. They expected technology to win the battle. Instead, one man's insane night runs would help hold the eastern flank. June 6, 1944. 16 hours. Bénouville and Ranville, Normandy, France. The night sky over German-occupied France filled with the sound of Halifax bombers straining under their loads. Behind each bomber, connected by thick tow ropes, rode massive horse-gliders packed with assault troops. Inside the gliders, men sat in 2 rows facing each other, strapped tightly into canvas seats, weapons between their knees, equipment pressing against their backs. They could hear nothing but wind screaming past the fuselage and the groaning of stressed wood. They could see nothing in the absolute darkness. They waited for the release. At Royal Air Force Tarrant Rushton hours earlier, an intelligence officer had pointed to 2 bridges on a large-scale map. The Bénouville Bridge crossed the Caen Canal. The Ranville Bridge crossed the Orne River. Both were vital. Both had to be taken intact. If German engineers destroyed them, the eastern flank of the invasion would collapse. If they remained standing, 2nd British Army could advance inland from the beaches with protection on its left flank. The bridges were the keystone. Everything depended on them. The mission fell to Major John Howard's D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. 181 men, 6 horse-gliders, 3 gliders per bridge. Each glider carried a platoon of 30 men, 1 officer, 2 sergeants, 27 soldiers. The plan was simple in concept: land next to the bridges, overwhelm the guards before they could trigger demolitions, hold until relieved. Execution would be complex. Everything had to work perfectly. The planning had consumed months. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed the bridges from every angle, flying low over heavy anti-aircraft defenses. Photo interpreters studied every image, identifying every German position, every pillbox, every strand of wire, every mine. Engineers calculated exactly where demolition charges would be placed and how to cut the wires. Scale models were built, accurate to the inch, allowing assault troops to walk through the mission repeatedly until every man knew his exact role from touchdown to objective secure. Glider pilots practiced precision landings at night, touching down on fields barely large enough to contain their aircraft without navigation lights or electronic aids. Just skill, judgment, and courage. They practiced in England on fields measured to match Norman fields. They practiced until they could land within 50 yards of their target in complete darkness. The margin for error was 0. If gliders landed short, troops would be too far from objectives. If they landed long, they would overshoot and crash. Only perfect landings would work. The tow aircraft departed England at 2300 hours on June 5th. They climbed to 6,000 feet, formed up into precise intervals, and crossed the English Channel following carefully calculated routes. German radar detected the formations. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Searchlights swept the sky. Tracer rounds arced upward in deadly beautiful patterns. Several aircraft took hits. Most pressed on. At the calculated release point over Normandy, marked by Pathfinder aircraft that had jumped minutes earlier, the tow ropes released. The gliders dropped away from their tow aircraft and descended in silence toward France below. Inside glider number 1, Major Howard checked his watch and calculated. 4 minutes to impact. He could see nothing through the small cockpit windows. The pilots flew by instinct and training, searching desperately for landmarks that would tell them where they were. The Caen Canal should be ahead. The bridge should be visible soon. Everything depended on being in exactly the right place. At 0:16 hours precisely, glider number 1 struck the Earth. The impact was violent beyond anything training had simulated. The wooden fuselage compressed, the landing skids tore loose, the nose crumpled. Men were thrown violently forward despite being strapped in. Equipment broke free and became projectiles. The glider skidded across the field, tearing through a barbed wire fence, and stopped abruptly just 50 yards from the western end of Bénouville Bridge. Perfect navigation. Perfect landing. Now the assault began. The side door blew open. Men poured out, weapons ready, moving instantly toward their objectives. German sentries on the bridge heard the crash and turned. Too late. British assault troops were already among them. The sentries died within seconds. A German machine gun position opened fire from a pillbox on the eastern side. Grenades silenced it. Within 2 minutes of landing, the bridge was in British hands. Gliders 2 and 3 landed seconds later with similar precision. One platoon secured the western end, one crossed the bridge to secure the eastern end, one moved to clear the village of Bénouville. At the Ranville Bridge 2 miles away, 3 more gliders landed with equally remarkable accuracy. 6 gliders, 6 precise landings in absolute darkness over enemy territory. The odds against such success were astronomical, yet it happened. But success came with cost. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, leading his platoon across Bénouville Bridge, was hit by machine gun fire from a German position that had survived the initial assault. He fell mortally wounded on the bridge itself, the first British soldier to die by enemy action on D-Day. His platoon continued without pause, overwhelming the German position and securing the far end. Lance Corporal Fred Greenhalgh drowned when glider number 3 crashed through the canal embankment on landing. The fuselage filled with freezing water faster than he could escape his harness. He died within sight of the objective. Combat engineers rushed to examine the bridges. They found demolition charges in place, wired for detonation. Working frantically, they removed detonators and cut wires before German defenders could trigger them, or before reinforcements arrived with orders to blow the bridges. At 0:21 hours, just 5 minutes after the first glider landed, engineers reported to Major Howard. Both bridges secure, both intact, demolitions neutralized. Mission accomplished. British after-action summaries would record this operation as textbook perfect. Operation Deadstick, as it was codenamed, achieved complete surprise through precision navigation, overwhelmed defenders through speed and violence, and secured objectives within minutes. The glider assault demonstrated that careful planning, intensive training, and skillful execution could achieve results that seemed impossible. Both bridges stood intact. The eastern flank of the invasion was protected. But the mission was only beginning. Taking the bridges was one thing. Holding them against inevitable German counterattacks would be far harder. Major Howard's force of 181 men now had to defend 2 bridges against an entire German division that would certainly arrive soon. Reinforcement would come from the main parachute drop, 6th Airborne Division, jumping at the same time across multiple drop zones. But would those reinforcements arrive? Would they arrive in time? Would they arrive with their weapons and equipment? The wider 6th Airborne drop, beginning at the same time as the glider landings, encountered immediate problems. High winds, much stronger than forecast, pushed aircraft off their carefully calculated flight paths. Anti-aircraft fire from alerted German defenders was heavier than expected. Some pilots took evasive action, disrupting formation integrity. Others pressed on through the fire, but arrived at drop zones from wrong angles. The result was catastrophic dispersion. Paratroopers exited their aircraft over the correct general area but scattered widely during descent. Some landed miles from their intended drop zones. Others came down in marshes deliberately flooded by German engineers as defensive obstacles. Several landed in villages occupied by German troops and were killed or captured immediately. Equipment containers, heavy metal canisters containing mortars, machine guns, anti-tank weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and radios scattered even more widely than the men. 7th Parachute Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Jeffrey Pine Coffin, had the critical mission of reinforcing the bridges and establishing a defensive perimeter around them. The battalion jumped from 12 aircraft at 0:20 hours. By 0:30 hours, when assembly should have been complete, only a fraction of the battalion had reached the rally points. Companies were scattered. Platoons were fragmented. Many soldiers were still searching for their units in the darkness. Equipment recovery was even worse. Of the dozens of containers dropped with the battalion, only a small percentage were recovered in the first hours. Some containers landed in the Dives River and sank. Others came down in German-held villages. Many landed in trees or thick hedgerows and were impossible to locate in darkness. Critical equipment, mortars for fire support, machine guns for sustained defensive fire, Piat anti-tank weapons for defending against German armor, was missing when it was needed most. Among the paratroopers who landed relatively close to their intended drop zone was Sergeant Sidney Cornell of B Company, 7th Parachute Battalion. Cornell, a native of Portsmouth, had volunteered for the Parachute Regiment when it formed in 1941. He completed the brutal selection process that eliminated most candidates, earned his Red Beret and parachute wings, and was assigned to 7th Para when it formed. Now, at age 24, he found himself in a Norman field in darkness, checking his weapon and trying to locate his company. Cornell carried standard paratrooper equipment: Lee Enfield rifle, 200 rounds of ammunition, grenades, rations, water bottle, first aid kit, entrenching tool, map, compass. He did not carry a radio. His assigned role: company runner. In an army that expected wireless communications to provide instant coordination, runners were considered backup, necessary, but hopefully not critical. Events would prove otherwise. The strategic stakes at Bénouville and Ronville were absolute and crystal clear. These bridges physically blocked German armored forces from striking directly at Sword Beach along the invasion's eastern flank. British Second Army landing at Sword would be desperately vulnerable during the first hours and days. German panzer divisions positioned east of the Orne River could use the bridges to reach the beaches within hours. Without the bridges, German armor would have to detour many miles north or south, losing critical time. The bridges also provided Second Army a protected corridor for advancing inland from the beachhead. Tanks, artillery, supplies, reinforcements, everything needed to sustain operations would flow across these bridges. Losing them would force British forces to find alternative crossing points under fire or wait for engineers to construct new bridges under enemy observation. Either option would delay operations and increase casualties dramatically. Finally, the bridges anchored the entire eastern flank of the invasion. If German forces controlled them, they could bring overwhelming firepower to bear on British positions from both sides of the waterways. British forces would be forced to fight in multiple directions simultaneously. The defensive line would crumble. The beachhead would collapse. The invasion could fail. Everything depended on holding these two bridges. But holding them required coordination across scattered units, and coordination required communication. When the wireless networks failed, as they did within the first hour, everything would depend on runners like Cornell carrying orders on foot under fire. The technology of 1944 promised instant wireless communication. The reality of combat in Norman bocage country would prove far different. Drop Zone N, northeast of Ranville Village. 0:50 hours, June 6, 1944. A signal sergeant knelt beside a hastily cleared patch of ground under a dense Norman hedgerow. Before him sat a wireless set number 18, its olive-drab metal case scratched and dented from the hard landing. He extended the telescoping aerial to full height, 10 feet of steel rod that would theoretically broadcast his signal across miles of Norman countryside. He connected the battery pack, checked the connections, flipped the power switch, and waited for the tubes to warm up. Static, just static. The receiver hissed with meaningless atmospheric noise. The sergeant adjusted the frequency dial slowly, searching across the authorized battalion command net frequency. More static. He checked the crystal, the small component that determined exact frequency. It appeared intact. He checked the battery voltage. Adequate? He repositioned the aerial, trying different angles. Still nothing but interference. The sergeant was not alone in his frustration. Across 6th Airborne Division's drop zones, dozens of other signals personnel were experiencing identical problems. The battalion net, the voice network that should link all companies to battalion headquarters, was almost completely silent. Company nets using the smaller wireless set, number 38 for platoon to company links, also dead or intermittent at best. The entire communications architecture, carefully planned and extensively rehearsed, had collapsed in the first hour of operations. Why did the radios fail so comprehensively? Multiple factors combined to create perfect communications disaster. First, equipment loss. Heavy containers carrying radios smashed into hard Norman ground at terminal velocity after parachute deployment. The impact, forces often exceeding 20 Gs, cracked battery cases, broke solder joints, shattered vacuum tubes, and bent chassis frames. Even containers with impact-absorbing packing could not protect delicate electronics from such forces. Second, water damage. Many containers landed in the flooded areas along the Dives River Valley, areas deliberately inundated by German engineers to create defensive obstacles. Radios submerged in water suffered immediate circuit failure. Even brief immersion was enough to short sensitive components. Recovery teams found containers in marshes and streams, pulled them out, opened them, and discovered useless equipment with water dripping from internal components. Third, battlefield damage. Containers landing in trees became tangled in branches 30 or 40 feet above ground. Antennas broke off. Cases split open when containers crashed through multiple branches. Some radios fell from damaged containers and hit the ground with full force. Others remained trapped in trees, visible but completely unreachable without specialized climbing equipment that no one had brought on an airborne assault. Fourth, enemy action. German patrols were already sweeping the countryside within minutes of the first parachute's opening. They found isolated paratroopers and equipment containers. Some British soldiers were killed or captured. Equipment containers were collected for intelligence evaluation. Radios that landed in or near German-occupied villages were lost before British recovery teams could reach them. In several cases, German troops were seen carrying British wireless sets away from contested areas. But even those radios that survived the drop and were successfully recovered faced severe operational challenges that made effective communication nearly impossible. The primary problem was terrain. Norman bocage, the distinctive landscape of small, irregular fields surrounded by ancient earthen banks topped with dense hedgerows, was perfect tank obstacle terrain. It was equally perfect radio signal obstacle terrain. The hedgerows themselves, some dating back centuries, consisted of earthen mounds 4 to 6 feet high, topped with dense growth of hawthorn, brambles, and other thick vegetation. These barriers absorbed and scattered radio signals. High-frequency transmissions from the number 18 could not effectively penetrate multiple hedgerow barriers. Very high-frequency signals from the number 38 were blocked even more effectively. Radio operators quickly discovered that signals that should travel miles in open terrain barely reached a few hundred yards in bocage. Stone buildings in Norman villages created additional obstacles. The thick-walled Norman farmhouses and churches were constructed of local stone. dense granite and limestone that absorbed and reflected radio waves in unpredictable patterns. Operators found that signals blocked by buildings in one direction might bounce off buildings in another direction, creating bizarre propagation effects. A station 100 yards away might be unreachable, while a station a mile away came through clearly. Weather and soil conditions added final complications. Recent heavy rains had saturated the Norman clay soil. Wet ground absorbed high-frequency radio signals more effectively than dry ground. The low-lying areas near the coast were particularly affected. Operators noticed that signals deteriorated further as morning fog rolled in from the channel, adding atmospheric moisture that degraded propagation even more. Military radio doctrine in 1944 envisioned clear communications architecture. Battalion headquarters would maintain constant voice contact with all company headquarters via the number 18 network. Company headquarters would maintain contact with platoon headquarters via the number 38 network. Commanders could issue orders instantly and receive situation reports in real time. Fire support could be coordinated precisely. Units could maneuver in coordination. Reality at 050 hours on June 6th bore no resemblance to doctrine. Battalion headquarters could contact perhaps one company in 4. Company headquarters could reach perhaps one platoon in 3. Most positions had no radio contact with anyone. The sophisticated wireless networks that promised perfect coordination had devolved into isolated stations, sending blind transmissions into static, hoping someone somewhere was listening. At B Company Command Post, hastily established under a hedgerow near Bénouville, Major Roger Neal faced immediate crisis. He commanded 3 platoons spread across defensive positions, covering approaches from multiple directions. He had no radio contact with any of them. He had intermittent contact with battalion headquarters. 1 weak transmission in 10 got through. He had no contact with adjacent companies. For practical purposes, his company was operating blind. Major Neal understood immediately that wireless communications could not be relied upon. He needed an alternative method of command and control, something simple, robust, and reliable. The solution was ancient. Runners. Men would carry written orders and verbal messages on foot between positions. It was slow. It was dangerous. But it would work when radios did not. Sergeant Sidney Cornell received his orders shortly after 0100 hours. Major Neal pointed at him. "You are the company runner. You will carry messages between my headquarters and the platoon positions. You will also run messages to battalion headquarters when required. You will move under fire. You will navigate using map and landmarks. You will memorize critical orders before departure. You will not fail." Cornell acknowledged the orders. He understood what being selected as company runner meant. It meant he would spend the next hours or days running across open ground under enemy fire. It meant he would be shot at constantly. It meant his survival was unlikely, but his mission was essential. Cornell prepared methodically. He checked his weapon, Lee Enfield rifle, clean and loaded. He checked his ammunition, 8 full magazines, 64 rounds total. He checked his map, waterproofed and marked with friendly positions. He checked his compass, functioning properly. He checked his message pad, paper dry, pencil sharp. He studied the terrain in the growing pre-dawn light, memorizing landmarks, identifying covered routes, noting dangerous open areas. He was ready. The company assembled its Tactical Operations Center under the best available cover, a thick hedgerow that provided concealment from observation and some protection from shell fragments. From this position, Major Neal could see some but not all of his defensive perimeter. 3 rifle platoons occupied positions roughly 400 meters apart, forming a rough triangle covering the approaches from east, north, and northeast. Each platoon had responsibility for a sector. Each platoon needed coordination with adjacent positions to prevent gaps. Without radio, all coordination would flow through runners. Major Neal needed to know what each platoon could see, what weapons they had recovered, what ammunition they possessed, whether they had made contact with enemy forces. Each platoon needed to know the company defensive plan, the locations of adjacent positions, the fire coordination plan, the withdrawal routes if positions became untenable. Information had to flow both ways continuously. Cornell checked his route one more time in the growing light. The first run would go to the northern platoon position, approximately 400 meters away across open fields and through a gap in a hedgerow. Enemy machine gun fire had already probed that area from unknown positions to the northeast. Mortars had dropped random rounds searching for targets. The route would be dangerous. But there was no alternative. Orders had to move. 0300 hours. June 6, 1944. Bénouville village perimeter. The eastern sky showed the first traces of gray that preceded dawn. In another hour, full daylight would arrive, and with it German reinforcements who would certainly attempt to retake the bridges. But German forces did not wait for daylight. The first counterattack came in darkness. A German infantry section, perhaps 8 to 12 men, advanced cautiously from the south, probing the British perimeter. They were supported by a single armored car, likely a Sedan KFZ, 222 or 232 wheeled reconnaissance vehicle, mounting a 20mm cannon. The vehicle moved slowly along a road approaching Bénouville, its commander uncertain what British strength he faced, but following orders to investigate the situation at the bridges. British Piat team positioned in a ditch beside the road waited until the armored car closed to 70 meters. At that range, even in darkness, a competent gunner could not miss. The eye, Piat fired with its characteristic loud crack. The 3-pound bomb flew across the distance in less than a second and struck the vehicle's thin side armor. The shaped charge warhead detonated, punching through armor plate and filling the interior with superheated metal fragments. The vehicle stopped immediately. No crew emerged. The German infantry, seeing their supporting vehicle destroyed, went to ground and began returning fire toward the British positions. Rifle fire cracked back and forth in darkness, neither side able to see targets clearly. British Bren guns joined the fight, their distinctive slow cyclic rate, 500 rounds per minute, compared to German MG-42s at 1,200 rounds per minute, providing aimed fire that forced the German infantry to withdraw. Within 10 minutes of initial contact, the attack was over. But the brief engagement revealed a serious coordination problem. The Vickers medium machine gun team positioned on the northern side of the perimeter had heard the firing and prepared to engage, believing they were under attack. Without clear orders about fire control and coordination, they had nearly opened fire on friendly positions, mistaking the firefight for an attack on their sector. Only the platoon commanders' shouted orders prevented a fratricide incident. Major Neal recognized immediately that fire discipline was already breaking down due to lack of communication. Each position was isolated, acting independently, unable to coordinate with adjacent positions. The next German attack might come from multiple directions simultaneously. If British positions fired without coordination, they would hit each other. Someone had to carry fire control orders to every position immediately. Cornell received the orders at 03:15 hours. Run to all 3 platoon positions. Deliver fire coordination plan. Northern sector holds fire except on confirmed enemy movement in assigned arc. Eastern sector, same restrictions. Southern sector maintains overwatch. Ensure every position commander understands the sectors of fire and confirms he will not engage outside his arc without explicit orders. Return with confirmation from each position. Time critical. Next attack could come any moment. Cornell's first combat run began at 03:20 hours. Distance to northern platoon, 400 meters. Route, across open field, no cover for first 200 meters, then along a hedgerow base for final 200 meters. Known threats: German machine gun had fired from somewhere to the northeast earlier, exact position unknown. Random mortar rounds had impacted in the area. Visibility: poor in pre-dawn darkness, but improving rapidly. He ran, not sprinting at full speed. That would exhaust him too quickly and make him more visible. A steady combat pace that covered ground quickly while maintaining control and awareness. Weapon held ready across his chest, eyes scanning constantly for threats, ears listening for the distinctive sounds of incoming fire, every sense alert. 100 meters out, machine gun fire cracked overhead. The distinctive sound of MG-42, German weapon, high cyclic rate, firing long bursts. The source was somewhere to his right front, distance uncertain. The tracers were not aimed at him specifically. The gunner was firing on speculation, putting rounds into likely British positions. But the beaten zone, the area where bullets impacted, was close enough that Cornell went flat immediately. He crawled. 20 meters through wet grass, staying as low as possible, moving during the gaps between machine gun bursts. The German gunner fired in 10-second bursts with 5-second pauses. Standard fire discipline to prevent barrel overheating. Cornell used the pauses to move, froze during the bursts. Slow progress, but steady. After 5 minutes of crawling, he was clear of the most dangerous area. He rose to a crouch and ran the final 100 meters to the platoon position. The platoon commander, Lieutenant Collins, had heard him coming and challenged with the password. Cornell responded correctly and was allowed into the position. He delivered the fire coordination orders verbally, ensuring the lieutenant understood the restrictions. He received the situation report. Platoon at 70% strength, 1 Bren gun operational, approximately 200 rounds per man. No casualties yet, but defensive wire not fully in place. He memorized the report and prepared to return. The return run used a different route. Never use the same path twice. Basic infantry survival. Machine gun fire followed him across the open ground but did not hit him. He made it back to company headquarters at 0340 hours. 20 minutes for 1 run. Total distance perhaps 800 meters, counting the crawling detour. First mission complete. 0400 hours. Second German attack. This one was more serious. Intelligence estimates suggested a reinforced platoon, perhaps 40 to 50 men, supported by 2 light tanks or assault guns moving from the east. The vehicles were identified by their engine sounds, distinctive diesel rumble of French tanks captured by Germans and pressed into service. They advanced cautiously along a road, infantry following in the vehicle's wake. British defensive plan called for Piat teams to engage armor while rifle and machine gun fire suppressed infantry. But Piat teams were running short on ammunition. The teams at the southern position had expended their initial ammunition loads, destroying the armored car in the first attack. They needed resupply immediately, or they could not engage the approaching tanks. Battalion supply point was 800 meters away across open ground. Someone had to make the run. Cornell received the mission at 0405 hours. Run to battalion supply point. Request priority resupply. Piat bombs, Bren magazines, grenades. Return with whatever could be carried. Time, absolutely critical. Tanks would be in engagement range within 15 to 20 minutes. If Piat teams had no ammunition when tanks arrived, the defensive line would break. He ran 800 meters to battalion supply point across open fields. German mortars had found the range now. Random rounds impacted across the area every minute or two. He heard them coming, the distinctive whistle shriek that gave perhaps 2 seconds warning. When he heard that sound, he went flat immediately. Mortar rounds landed 50 meters away, 70 meters, 30 meters. Close enough that shrapnel whined through the air above him. But nothing hit him. He reached battalion supply point, a commandeered farm building now serving as ammunition dump. He delivered the request to the quartermaster sergeant, who was already organizing supplies for multiple units. Priority request acknowledged. The sergeant and 2 soldiers loaded a canvas sack with Piat bombs, heavy 3-pound projectiles, awkward to carry. Cornell slung the sack over his shoulder, perhaps 30 pounds of bombs, and started back. The return run was harder, 30 pounds of additional weight. Fatigue setting in. Morning light increasing visibility, making him more obvious target. Machine gun fire tracked him across the last 300 meters. He zigzagged, changed pace randomly, used every fold in the ground for momentary cover. Reached company headquarters. Distributed Piat bombs to the teams. Total time for the run, 30 minutes. Distance, 1,600 meters. Weight carried, 30 pounds. Messages delivered. 1. Ammunition delivered. Critical resupply accomplished. 0430 hours. The German tanks arrived. Piat teams engaged at 75 meters. First bomb hit the lead tank on frontal armor, thickest protection, and did not penetrate. Shape charge warhead detonated, but the armor held. The tank stopped and traversed its turret, searching for the threat. Second Piat bomb hit the same tank from a different angle, striking thinner side armor. This time, the warhead penetrated. The tank brewed up, ammunition inside detonating, flames erupting from hatches. Crew did not escape. Second tank immediately reversed, seeking cover. The infantry attack lost momentum without armored support and was beaten back by concentrated rifle and machine gun fire. German forces withdrew again, but the engagement demonstrated that ammunition consumption was severe and resupply would be a constant problem. Cornell's run had enabled the defense to succeed. Without Piat bombs, tanks would have penetrated the perimeter. 0530 hours. German aircraft appeared, single bomber that had slipped through Allied air cover. It made one pass over the bridges and dropped a single large bomb. The bomb struck the Caen-Canal Bridge roadway with tremendous impact. The bridge shuddered. British soldiers nearby were knocked down by the blast wave. Debris flew in all directions. When the dust cleared, the bridge still stood, but a massive unexploded bomb was buried in the roadway. Engineers examined the bomb, 1,000 pounds of high explosive, British manufacture captured by Germans, detonator apparently damaged on impact, completely unsafe to move with available equipment. The bomb sat in the center of the bridge roadway like a monument to uncertainty. Any vehicle crossing the bridge would have to navigate around it. Any heavy shock might detonate it. Traffic patterns had to be reorganized immediately. Major Neal needed new orders distributed to every position. Vehicles take western route across bridge. Infantry take eastern route. All personnel maintain maximum distance from unexploded ordnance. No one approaches the bomb without engineer authorization. Simple orders, but they had to reach every position quickly before someone inadvertently triggered the bomb. Cornell ran the circuit again, 3 platoon positions plus a detour to inform engineers establishing a demolition guard. Total distance, approximately 2 kilometers. Time, 45 minutes. The unexploded bomb would remain in place for 3 days until specialist teams arrived to defuse it. 0600 hours, major German attack. This was the serious attempt to retake the bridges, a full company of infantry, estimated at 150 men, supported by at least 3 armored vehicles, including 1 medium tank, probably a Panzer IV. The attack came from the east in the growing daylight, moving with tactical proficiency that indicated these were not hastily assembled local garrison troops, but trained combat soldiers from a frontline unit. Every British weapon engaged. Vickers machine guns laid down sustained fire into the advancing infantry, their water-cooled barrels allowing continuous fire that would overheat and disable air-cooled weapons. Bren guns provided accurate aimed fire at priority targets. Riflemen engaged at 200 to 300 meters. Piat teams waited for armor to close before firing. They had limited ammunition and could not waste rounds. 3-inch mortars based farther back provided indirect fire support based on observed targets. The firefight lasted 40 minutes. Piat teams destroyed 2 light tanks and damaged the Panzer IV, forcing it to withdraw. Machine gun and rifle fire stopped the infantry assault short of British positions. German forces pulled back after taking heavy casualties, estimated 30 to 50 men killed or wounded. But British ammunition expenditure was severe. Major Neal conducted rapid ammunition count, 3-inch mortar bombs nearly exhausted, less than 20 rounds remaining from initial load of 100. Bren gun magazines down to final reserves, perhaps 5 magazines per gun. Vickers machine gun ammunition adequate, but not abundant. Another sustained firefight would exhaust supplies. Piat bombs critical, only 6 rounds remaining across all teams. Rifle ammunition better, but not comfortable, average. Soldier down to 4 full magazines. Someone had to reach battalion headquarters with detailed ammunition status report and request emergency resupply. Radio was still not functioning reliably. Occasional transmissions got through, but could not sustain extended communication required for detailed logistics coordination. The mission fell to Cornell again. Run to battalion headquarters with full ammunition status. Request emergency resupply priority items. Return with acknowledgement and estimated delivery time. Cornell departed at 06:45 hours. Distance to battalion headquarters, 1,000 meters directly, but 2,000 meters using safe routes. German forces now had observation of the direct route and machine guns covering it. He had to detour north, use covered approaches, cross open areas only when suppressive fire from friendly positions forced German heads down. Halfway to battalion headquarters, German mortars began systematic bombardment of the area. Rounds impacted every 30 seconds in a pattern suggesting forward observers were directing fire. Cornell heard the rounds coming. He was learning to distinguish the whistle of 8-centimeter mortar rounds from the shriek of larger artillery. He went flat during impacts, rose and ran during the intervals. Progress was slow but steady. Machine gun fire pursued him across the final 300 meters. He could hear rounds snapping past, the distinctive supersonic crack that meant bullets were close. He dove into a ditch, crawled 50 meters along its base, using it for cover, emerged near battalion headquarters, and sprinted the final distance. Arrived gasping, uniform torn by shrapnel, hands bleeding from crawling through brambles, but message intact and ready to deliver. Battalion quartermaster received the ammunition status and immediately began organizing emergency resupply convoy. But moving supplies forward under current fire conditions would take time and cost casualties. Estimated delivery, 2 hours minimum. Cornell received acknowledgement and began the return run with this information for Major Neal. The company would have to hold for 2 more hours on current ammunition stocks and defend against any further German attacks with whatever remained. The return run was no easier than the outbound journey. Machine gun fire had intensified. German forces were bringing more weapons to bear. Cornell used every scrap of cover, every fold in the ground, every moment of distraction when German gunners shifted to other targets. He arrived back at company headquarters at 07:30 hours. Total time for the mission, 45 minutes. Distance covered, approximately 4 kilometers. Information delivered, critical logistics coordination accomplished. His uniform was shredded, his hands were bleeding, his canteen was empty. But he had not failed. By 0800 hours on D-Day morning, Cornell had completed 6 combat runs totaling approximately 10 kilometers, under fire. He had delivered critical fire coordination orders, carried emergency ammunition resupply requests, distributed traffic control orders, and maintained the information flow that kept B Company functioning as a coordinated unit rather than isolated positions. And the longest day was only beginning.